The night I finally called him was the night I ran out of options and maybe ran straight into something worse. The pounding on the front door wasn't loud at first, just a dull, patient rhythm like someone who knew they didn't need to rush, like time was already on their side. And I stood frozen in the middle of my tiny living room, barefoot on cold hardwood, my son clinging to my leg as the lights flickered once, twice, before settling into a dim, tired glow that made everything feel smaller than it already was. Liam's fingers twisted into my sweatshirt, his breathing uneven against my hip, and I could feel the heat of his fever through the thin fabric. Too warm, too fast, the kind of warmth that makes your chest tighten because you know something isn't right. Not tonight, not with everything else already pressing in. I checked the deadbolt again even though I knew it was locked, even though I'd checked it 3 times in the last minute. And the sound came again, heavier now, more certain, the kind that didn't ask for permission. My phone sat on the counter where I'd left it, screen dark, silent, useless after the last 3 calls went nowhere. Doctor, neighbor, even the landlord, and every number I trusted had turned into nothing when I needed it most. Mom, Liam whispered, his voice thin, are they coming in? And I forced my hand to smooth over his hair, forced my voice to stay steady even as my pulse climbed into my throat. No, baby, I'm right here. But the truth sat heavy in my chest because I wasn't enough. Not tonight, not against whatever was waiting on the other side of that door. The pounding stopped, and somehow that silence felt worse, like a held breath before something breaks. And that's when I noticed it. The old number at the top of my call history, buried but never gone. A name I hadn't said out loud in years, a promise I had made to myself I would never break. Adrian. My thumb hovered over it, trembling, because calling him didn't just mean help. It meant opening a door I had spent 5 years trying to keep shut. It meant letting his world find me again, the world I had fought so hard to leave behind for Liam, for a life that felt safe. Even when it wasn't easy. Another sound outside, softer now, like voices just out of reach, and Liam tightened his grip, his small body pressing closer, as if he could disappear into me. And something inside me gave way, something quiet and final, because this wasn't about pride anymore, or fear, or the past. This was about my son. I picked up the phone, my hands colder than they should have been, and tapped the number before I could change my mind, before I could remember why I shouldn't, and it rang once, twice, each second stretching longer than it should, until the line clicked and the silence on the other end felt different, heavier, like someone who didn't need to speak to be heard. My voice came out barely above a whisper, breaking in the middle despite everything I tried to hold together. Please come home. I don't know what to do anymore. For a moment, there was nothing, just the faint sound of his breathing, steady, controlled, unchanged by time or distance. And then he spoke, low and certain, like he'd been waiting for this call all along. Stay where you are, he said, and something in the way he said it made the room feel smaller, safer, and infinitely more dangerous all at once. I'm coming. The silence after his voice ended did not feel empty. It felt occupied, like something had already shifted in the air around me, something I could not see but could feel pressing against my skin, tightening the space between each breath, and I realized I was holding onto the phone long after the line went dead, as if letting go would somehow undo the one decision I could not take back. Liam stirred against me, his forehead hotter now, his small fingers curling into my sleeve as he looked up with glassy eyes that made my chest ache in a way fear never could. Is someone coming? He asked, and I swallowed hard before answering, because the truth was not simple, not safe. Yes, baby, someone is coming. And even as I said it, I did not know if that was comfort or a warning. Outside, the quiet stretched too long, and then I heard it, not footsteps, not voices, but engines, low and controlled, the kind that did not belong in neighborhoods like mine, the kind that made people look out their windows and then quickly step away, pretending they had seen nothing at all, and headlights swept across the thin curtains, cutting through the dim room in sharp, white lines that made everything feel exposed. My heart started beating faster, not from the noise, but from the recognition, because some things you do not forget, no matter how many years you try to bury them, and the sound of those engines was one of them. I moved quickly, guiding Liam toward the hallway, away from the windows, away from the front door that now stood too thin, too fragile between us and whatever was about to happen, and I knelt in front of him, brushing damp strands of hair from his forehead, forcing myself to focus on him, only him, because if I let my mind drift even an inch toward the past, I would fall apart. "Stay right here, okay?" I whispered, keeping my voice steady. "No matter what you hear, you stay right here." He nodded slowly, trusting me in that quiet way children do, the kind of trust that feels like both a gift and a weight. And I stood, my legs unsteady as I turned back toward the living room just as the front door handle moved, once, deliberate, like someone testing the boundary before deciding whether it mattered at all. I did not remember unlocking it, but somehow it was not locked anymore, or maybe it never mattered in the first place, because the door opened anyway, slow and controlled, not forced, not rushed, just certain, and the air changed the moment it did, like the room itself recognized him before I even saw him. He stepped inside without hesitation, tall, composed, dressed in dark lines that seemed to absorb the weak light around him, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe, because time had not touched him the way it had touched me. It had sharpened him instead, made him more defined, more dangerous in a way that did not need to be explained. Adrian Cole did not look at me first, and that somehow felt worse, because his attention moved through the room, cataloging, assessing, as if every detail mattered, as if every risk had already been measured before he crossed the threshold. And when his eyes finally landed on me, it was not surprise I saw there, not even anger, just recognition, steady and inevitable. "You should not be here," I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out weaker than I intended, and his expression did not change, not even slightly, as he stepped closer, each movement controlled, precise, like everything about him still followed rules I could not see. "You called me," he replied, his voice low, unchanged, the same voice that used to make me feel safe and trapped all at once, and I felt that old pull again, sharp and unwelcome, twisting somewhere deep inside me. Behind him, I caught glimpses of shadows moving outside, men who did not need to enter to be present, and the realization settled heavy in my chest that nothing about this night was small anymore. Nothing about it was contained, because Adrian did not arrive quietly, and he never left things unfinished. Liam's voice broke the tension, soft but clear from the hallway. "Mom?" And Adrian's gaze shifted instantly, something flickering there for the first time, something I had not seen before, and in that moment, I understood something I had tried very hard not to think about, something that made everything more complicated than I was ready to face, because this was not just about calling for help. This was about what happens when the past does not stay buried, when it walks through your front door, and decides it belongs there. Everything inside me went still the moment Adrian took a step toward the hallway, like my body understood before my mind did that nothing about this moment could be undone once it started, and I moved instinctively, placing myself between him and Liam without thinking, not out of fear of what he would do, but out of fear of what this would become. "You do not need to go back there," I said, my voice quieter now but firmer, because this was the line I had drawn years ago, the one I had built my entire life around, and I could feel it cracking under the weight of his presence alone. Adrian stopped, not because I blocked him, but because he chose to, and that was somehow worse, because it meant everything that happened next would be on his terms, just like it always had been, and his eyes dropped briefly to where my hands were clenched at my sides before lifting back to my face, calm, unreadable, as if he already knew how this conversation would end. "He called for you," I added, softer now, hating the way my voice betrayed me, and something shifted in his expression, not visible enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, because I had spent years memorizing the smallest changes in him, back when knowing him had felt like survival instead of risk. "I heard him," Adrian replied, and then, without raising his voice, without looking away from me, he said something that made the room feel smaller, heavier, like the air itself had changed direction. "Move, Emily." It was not a command shouted in anger. It was quieter than that, controlled, inevitable, and my body reacted before my thoughts could catch up, stepping aside by inches, not because I agreed, but because some part of me still remembered what it meant when he spoke like that, and I hated that I had not unlearned it. He walked past me then, not brushing against me, not even close, but the space he moved through felt charged, like everything in his orbit carried weight, and I turned slowly, my heart climbing into my throat as I followed a few steps behind, watching as he reached the hallway where Liam stood exactly where I had told him to, small and pale under the weak light, his eyes wide but steady in that quiet, observant way that had always been too old for his age. For a second, neither of them moved, and the silence between them stretched in a way that felt unfamiliar, uncertain, because this was not a world Liam understood, and it was not a version of Adrian I had ever seen before. Not like this. Not with something unguarded flickering just beneath the surface of his control. "Hey," Adrian said finally, his voice lower now, different in a way that made my chest tighten, and Liam tilted his head slightly, studying him with a seriousness that mirrored his own, as if he were trying to place something he did not yet have words for. "You came," Liam said, simple and certain, like it had never been a question, and I saw it then. The smallest fracture in Adrian's composure, gone as quickly as it appeared but real enough that it left something behind, something heavier than any threat waiting outside. Adrian crouched down, just enough to meet Liam's level, not touching him, not reaching out, just there, present in a way that felt deliberate, careful, and for the first time since he walked in, his attention was not scanning, not calculating, it was focused entirely on the small boy in front of him. "I told your mom I would," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something that made my stomach twist because I knew that tone. I knew what it meant when he made a promise like that, even if it was not spoken out loud. Liam hesitated for a second, then stepped forward, closing the distance on his own, and his small hand reached out, fingers brushing lightly against Adrian's sleeve as if testing whether he was real, whether he would disappear if he held on too tightly, and Adrian did not move away, did not react the way I expected. He just stayed there, letting it happen, letting that connection exist in the quiet space between them. I should have stopped it, should have said something, should have reminded myself why this was dangerous, why this could not be allowed to grow into anything more than a moment. But I could not, because standing there, watching them, I realized something I had been avoiding since the second I made that call, something that settled deep in my chest with a certainty I could not ignore. This was never just about asking for help. And Adrian was never going to be just someone who showed up and left again. The moment Liam's fingers curled more firmly around Adrian's sleeve, something inside me tightened in a way I could not explain, not fear exactly, not anger, but something sharper, something closer to the realization that I was losing control of a situation I had barely been holding together to begin with. And I took a step forward before I could stop myself, my voice cutting through the quiet space between them. "He is sick," I said, more urgently than I intended, because if I did not redirect this moment, it would turn into something I was not ready to face, something I had spent years avoiding. Adrian's gaze shifted instantly, not startled, not confused, just focused, like everything else disappeared the second new information entered the room, and he reached out then, not toward Liam's hand, but toward his forehead, his touch light, deliberate, the kind of touch that measured rather than comforted, and Liam did not pull away, did not flinch, just watched him with that same quiet intensity that made my chest ache. "How long?" Adrian asked without looking at me, his voice calm but edged with something sharper underneath, and I crossed my arms tightly, trying to ground myself in something solid. "Since this afternoon," I answered, forcing my tone to stay even. "It got worse an hour ago." He nodded once, already processing, already moving steps ahead in a way that made everything feel faster, more controlled, and without another word, he stood, pulling his phone from his pocket with practiced ease, dialing a number I knew would not go unanswered. "I need a pediatric specialist," he said, his voice low but absolute. "Now. Fever, rapid onset. I am sending the location." He ended the call before anyone could respond, like the answer was already guaranteed, like the outcome had never been in question, and I felt that same unsettling mix of relief and unease settle into my chest, because this was what Adrian did. He fixed things, he removed uncertainty, but nothing he touched ever stayed simple. "You did not need to do that," I said, even though part of me knew how empty those words sounded, and he finally looked at me fully, his expression unreadable but steady. "You called me," he repeated, as if that explained everything, as if that alone justified his presence, his decisions, the way the night was unfolding around us. Outside, I could still hear movement, subtle but constant, a reminder that he had not come alone, that this house, this life I had built, was no longer just mine to control, and the weight of that realization pressed heavier with every passing second. Liam swayed slightly, his small body leaning closer to Adrian without hesitation, like he had already decided where he felt safest, and before I could react, Adrian's hand moved to steady him, firm but careful, guiding him toward the couch with a quiet certainty that made it clear he expected to be listened to, not questioned. "Sit," he said softly to Liam, and then, glancing at me, "He needs water." I moved automatically, grabbing a glass from the kitchen, filling it with hands that were steadier than I felt, because doing something, anything, kept me from thinking too much about what was happening right in front of me. When I returned, Adrian was already there beside Liam, one hand resting lightly against his shoulder, not holding him, not restraining him, just present, and Liam leaned into it without hesitation, like it had always been there, like it belonged there. "Drink this, sweetheart," I said, kneeling in front of him, and he obeyed, taking small sips while Adrian watched closely, not intrusive, just aware, like he was memorizing every detail without needing to ask questions. The room felt different now, quieter in a way that did not feel empty, but full, like something had settled into place whether I wanted it to or not. And I realized with a slow, sinking clarity that the hardest part of this night was not the fear outside the door, not the uncertainty that had pushed me to make that call. It was this, standing here, watching the man I had tried so hard to leave behind step effortlessly into the space I had built without him, and realizing that he fit there in a way I could not deny, no matter how much I wanted to. The sound of tires on wet pavement came first, softer than the ones before, slower, deliberate in a different way, and Adrian's head turned slightly toward the door, as if he had been expecting that exact moment down to the second, his attention shifting without urgency, but with certainty, and I felt it again, that quiet realization that nothing happening tonight was a coincidence. Nothing was out of his control. A knock followed, firm but respectful, not the kind that demanded entry, but the kind that waited for permission, and Adrian did not raise his voice, did not even look away from Liam as he spoke. "It is open," he said, and the door moved a second later, revealing a man in a dark coat carrying a compact medical bag, his posture straight, his expression focused but calm, like someone used to being called into situations that did not allow for hesitation. "Mr. Cole," the man acknowledged with a slight nod before stepping inside, and that was all it took for me to understand that Adrian had not just called for help, he had called for someone who answered only to him. "This way," Adrian said, gesturing toward the couch, and the man moved immediately, kneeling beside Liam with quiet efficiency, asking gentle questions, checking his temperature, listening, observing, all without disrupting the fragile calm that had settled over the room. I stepped back slightly, giving space, but my eyes never left Liam, watching every movement, every reaction, searching for something I could hold on to, some sign that things were turning in the right direction. "It is a high fever," the doctor said after a moment, his voice steady, reassuring, but manageable. "I will administer something to bring it down and monitor him for a bit." Relief hit me so quickly it almost made me unsteady, like my body had been bracing for something worse and did not know how to react to the possibility that it might not come, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping for the first time since the night began. Adrian did not move, did not visibly react, but I noticed the subtle shift in his stance, the way the tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction, and it struck me how easily he hid everything, how nothing about him was ever fully visible unless you knew where to look. Liam blinked up at the doctor, then at Adrian, his small voice softer now, but clearer than before. "Are you staying?" he asked, not to me, but to him, and the question hung in the air in a way that made everything else fade into the background for a second, because it was not just about tonight, not really. Adrian's gaze held his, steady, unwavering, and when he answered, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had followed him into this house. "Yes," he said simply, and something in Liam's expression relaxed, like that one word had been enough to anchor him, enough to quiet whatever fear had been lingering beneath the fever. I turned away then, just for a second, pressing my hand against the edge of the counter to steady myself, because this was exactly what I had been afraid of, not the danger outside, not the uncertainty, But this, the way Adrian could step into our lives and shift everything with so little effort, the way he could become something Liam looked to without even trying. You cannot stay, I said quietly, not looking at him, because if I did, I might hesitate, and I could not afford that, not now. This is not your place anymore. The words felt thinner than I wanted them to, weaker against the reality unfolding around us. And when I finally turned back, Adrian was already watching me, his expression unreadable but intent, like he was weighing something I could not see. You called me here, he said again, not as a reminder, but as a fact, something solid and undeniable, and I felt that same shift in the air, that same quiet pressure building beneath the surface. And I came. The way he said it did not feel like an explanation. It felt like a boundary being redrawn in real time, one that I no longer had full control over, and I opened my mouth to respond, to push back, to remind him that showing up did not give him the right to stay, but the words did not come as easily as they should have, not when Liam was right there, not when the room itself seemed to lean in his direction. The doctor adjusted the small thermometer, checking the reading again before offering a calm nod. It is already starting to come down, he said, his tone reassuring. He should be more comfortable within the next 30 minutes. Relief washed through me again, quieter this time, more controlled, but still enough to make my knees feel lighter, and I sat beside Liam, brushing my fingers gently through his hair as he leaned into the cushion, his breathing slower now, steadier, the sharp edge of panic fading into something softer. Adrian remained standing just a step away, not hovering, not interfering, but present in a way that made it impossible to forget he was there, like the room itself adjusted around him without needing permission. You should rest, the doctor added, glancing at me. You look exhausted. I let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh, because exhaustion felt like the least important thing in this moment, but I nodded anyway, because it was easier than explaining everything that had led to this night. The doctor packed his bag with practiced movements, standing a moment later and giving Adrian a brief look that seemed to carry more than words before heading toward the door, leaving as quietly as he had arrived. And just like that, the house felt smaller again, but not the same kind of small it had been before. The silence that followed was different, heavier, filled with everything neither of us had said yet, and I felt Adrian's attention shift back to me, steady, patient, like he had all the time in the world to wait for whatever I was going to say next. He is going to be fine, I said, more to myself than to him, my voice softer now, and Adrian gave a slight nod, as if that outcome had never been in doubt. Liam stirred beside me, his eyes half open, heavy with sleep but still searching, and without thinking, his hand reached out again, this time not for me, but for Adrian, fingers brushing lightly against his wrist before settling there, as if that connection had already been decided somewhere deeper than logic. Adrian looked down at that small hand for a moment, something unreadable flickering across his face, and then he did not pull away, did not correct it. He simply let it remain, his stillness saying more than any words could have. I felt something twist inside me, something complicated and unwelcome, because this was exactly what I had feared, not the danger outside, not the uncertainty, but this quiet, undeniable shift, the way Adrian's presence was already weaving itself into something Liam instinctively trusted. This does not change anything, I said finally, forcing the words out before I could second-guess them, before I could soften them, because I needed to hold on to something that was still mine. Adrian's gaze lifted to meet mine, calm, steady, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with everything we were not saying, everything we had left unresolved years ago. It already has, he replied quietly, not challenging, not aggressive, just certain, and the way he said it made my chest tighten, because I knew he was right, even if I did not want to admit it. Outside, the faint hum of engines still lingered, a reminder that his world had not stayed at the door, that it waited, patient and present, just beyond the walls I had built, and I realized then that calling him had not just brought help into my home, it had brought everything that came with him, everything I had tried so hard to leave behind. And now, standing here with Liam's small hand resting against his wrist, and that quiet certainty in his eyes, I could not tell where the danger ended and where something else began. The quiet that followed his words did not feel like an ending. It felt like the moment right before something irreversible settles into place, and I could not look away from him even if I wanted to, because there was something in the way Adrian stood there, still and certain, that made everything else feel temporary, like the life I had built without him was suddenly being measured against something older, something I had never fully escaped. Liam shifted beside him, his breathing slower now, his small hand still resting against Adrian's wrist like it had found something it did not want to let go of, and Adrian did not move, did not adjust. He simply stayed exactly where he was, as if breaking that contact was not an option he was willing to consider. I stood up slowly, the distance between us feeling smaller than it should have, heavier than it used to, and I crossed my arms tightly, grounding myself in something familiar, something I could still control. "You do not get to decide that," I said, my voice steadier now, sharper, because if I let him define this moment, I would lose more than I was ready to admit. Adrian's gaze held mine, unflinching, and for a second, I saw something beneath the calm surface, something older, something that had not changed despite everything that had passed between us. "I do not need to decide it," he replied quietly. "You already did when you called me." The truth of that hit harder than I expected, not because I did not know it, but because hearing it out loud made it impossible to deny. And I felt that familiar pull again, the one I had spent years resisting, the one that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the way he made the world feel simpler and more dangerous at the same time. "This was about Liam," I said quickly, almost too quickly, needing to separate him from this, needing to protect at least one thing from becoming complicated. "This was not about you." Adrian did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched in a way that made me uneasy, because he had never needed many words to shift a situation in his favor, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but no less certain. "Everything about this is about him," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Liam before returning to me. "That is exactly why I am here." The way he said it made something inside me tighten, because it did not sound like an argument. It sounded like a statement of fact, something he had already accepted as truth whether I agreed or not. Liam stirred again, his eyes opening just enough to focus, and he looked between us with quiet confusion, like he could sense the tension without understanding it. And then he said something that made the room fall completely still. "Are you my dad?" The question was simple, innocent in a way that cut deeper than anything else that had been said tonight, and I felt my breath catch before I could stop it, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the moment I had always known might come, but had never been ready to face. I turned toward Adrian instinctively, expecting hesitation, deflection, something controlled and calculated, but what I saw instead was something else entirely, something unguarded for just a fraction of a second before it disappeared beneath the composure I knew so well. He did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than any of us could ignore, and for the first time since he walked through that door, I saw something in him that was not control, not certainty, but something closer to wait, like the answer mattered in a way even he could not dismiss. Liam's fingers tightened slightly around his wrist, waiting, trusting, and Adrian looked down at him, then back at me, and in that brief exchange of glances, I understood something I had not been ready to accept until now. This was not just a question. It was a turning point. And whatever happened next, none of us were going back to the way things were before. The question did not echo. It settled, heavy and unmoving in the center of the room like something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be spoken out loud, and I felt it in my chest before I could even process the words. A sharp, quiet impact that made it harder to breathe, harder to think, because there was no easy way to answer it. No safe way to redirect it without breaking something that had already begun to form. "Liam," I said quickly, my voice softer than I intended, reaching for something to ground him, to delay the moment. But his eyes stayed on Adrian, steady, patient in that way children are when they sense the truth is close enough to touch. And Adrian did not look away from him either, did not retreat, did not deflect. He just stood there, still as ever, but no longer distant. The silence stretched, but it did not feel empty anymore. It felt full of everything we had not said for years, everything I had buried, everything he had never asked for permission to carry. And when Adrian finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, like he understood exactly how fragile this moment was, like he knew one wrong step could break something that could not be repaired. He lowered himself slightly, not fully kneeling, just enough to meet Liam at eye level. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the edge, the authority, everything that usually defined him. "What do you think?" he asked, not avoiding the question, but placing it gently back in Liam's hands, and I felt my breath catch, because that was not control, that was something else, something I did not have a name for. Liam frowned slightly, thinking, his small fingers still resting against Adrian's wrist, like that connection had already decided more than words could, and then he said, "You came when Mom was scared." Simple, direct, the kind of truth that does not need explanation, and Adrian's gaze softened in a way I had never seen before, not visible to anyone who did not know him, but unmistakable to me. "I did," Adrian replied, just as simply, and Liam nodded, as if that confirmed something important, something enough. I stepped forward then, unable to stay silent any longer, because this was moving too fast, too far beyond what I could control, and I needed to pull it back, needed to remind both of them that this was not that simple. "That does not mean anything," I said, my voice firmer now, trying to anchor the moment back in reality. But even as I said it, it felt weaker than I wanted, like the truth had already shifted without asking me. Adrian's eyes lifted to meet mine, calm but steady, and there was something different there now, something that did not retreat just because I pushed. "It means exactly what it needs to mean," he said quietly, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it did not sound like a negotiation, it sounded like something already decided. Liam yawned softly, his energy fading as the fever eased, and he leaned slightly closer to Adrian without hesitation, his head tilting just enough that it rested against his arm, and Adrian adjusted without thinking, just enough to support him, not holding, not claiming, just there, present in a way that felt steady and real. I watched them, caught between wanting to step in and wanting to understand what I was seeing, because this was not how I expected this night to unfold. This was not how any of this was supposed to go, and yet it was happening anyway, quietly, naturally, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to exist. Outside, the world was still there, still waiting, but inside this small space, something had shifted in a way I could not ignore, and I realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that the question Liam had asked was not just his, it was mine too, and the answer was no longer something I could keep avoiding, no matter how much I wanted to. For a long moment, no one spoke, and the quiet no longer felt fragile, it felt settled, like something had finally reached the surface after years of being buried, and I realized I was standing in the middle of a moment I could not control anymore, no matter how much I wanted to pull it back. Liam's breathing evened out completely, his small body relaxing against Adrian's side as sleep slowly claimed him, the fever breaking in gentle waves that softened the tension in his face, and Adrian adjusted again, without thinking, one arm shifting just enough to keep him steady, to make sure he did not slip, the movement so natural it almost felt practiced, like this was not the first time, like this was something he had always known how to do. I watched them, my arms still crossed, but no longer as tight, because holding onto that resistance felt heavier now, harder to justify when the reality in front of me did not match the fear I had carried for so long. "He is going to need rest," I said quietly, more to fill the silence than to state the obvious, and Adrian nodded once, his attention still on Liam, not distant, not distracted, just present in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Carefully, he shifted, lifting Liam just enough to guide him down onto the couch, his movements slow, deliberate, making sure not to wake him, and I stepped forward instinctively, adjusting the blanket over him, tucking it gently around his shoulders, our hands brushing for a brief second before pulling away, the contact light, but enough to send a familiar tension through my chest. "You cannot stay," I said again, softer this time, not as a command, but as something I needed to hear out loud, something I was trying to hold on to before it slipped completely out of my control. Adrian straightened, his full attention returning to me, and for a moment, the room seemed to shift back to what it had been when he first walked in, that quiet weight of presence, that certainty that did not need to raise its voice to be felt. "I am not here for permission," he said, not harsh, not dismissive, just honest in a way that left no space for negotiation, and I felt that same pull again, the the one I had spent years fighting, the one that made everything feel clearer and more dangerous at the same time. This is not your world anymore, I said, meeting his gaze, refusing to step back even when it would have been easier. You do not get to walk in and decide where you belong. For a second, something in his expression shifted, not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something that made my chest tighten because I recognized it, even if I did not want to. I never left, he said quietly, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said tonight, because they were not about this house or this moment. They were about everything in between, everything I had tried to rewrite on my own. I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against that truth, trying to hold on to the version of my life that had felt stable, predictable, safe enough to survive. You left us with nothing, I said, my voice steady but low, because this was the part one had never said out loud, the part one had carried alone for years. Adrian did not interrupt, did not defend himself immediately, and that silence felt different, not calculated, not controlled, but intentional, like he was choosing to let me say it, to let it exist between us. I left you with distance, he replied after a moment, his voice just as quiet, because that was the only way to keep you out of what I am. The words hung there, heavier than I expected, because they were not an excuse, they were a truth I had never fully considered, and I felt something shift again, something I could not easily push away this time. Behind me, Liam stirred slightly but did not wake, his breathing steady, safe, and I glanced back at him for just a second before looking at Adrian again, because no matter what this was, no matter what it became, everything now circled back to that small, quiet presence on the couch. Adrian followed my gaze, his expression softening just enough to reveal something real, something unguarded for a fraction of a second, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, but certain in a way that left no doubt about what he meant. You called me home, Emily, he said, his eyes returning to mine, steady, unwavering, and I am not leaving again.